Ja, dann schreiten wir voran. Und zwar, wir sind eigentlich damit dann, wie schon gesagt, wir neigen uns schon so dem Ende der Konferenz zu. Wir skippen gerade die Kaffeepause. Und da soll eigentlich der digitale Aufschlag auch nicht fehlen. Last but not least, muss man auch sagen. Wir haben hierzu, finde ich, ein wunderbares Duo gefunden. Zwar Tim Kohl und Magdalena Kröner. Und Tim Kohl macht den Anfang und mir gefällt eigentlich ein Satz aus seinen 10 Thesen der digitalen Aufklärung am besten. Digitalisierung und Vernetzung sind kein Schnupfen, es geht nicht wieder weg. So, das ist fast schon wie die Fußballregeln, das Runde muss ins Eckige und Punkt. Tim Kohl ist ein Pionier des Internets. In den Anfängen des digitalen Zeitalters erfasste der Deutsch-Amerikaner als einer der ersten Journalisten die Bedeutung des World Wide Web. Heute führt der Experte für Wirtschaftstechnik Unternehmen und Menschen mit seinen spannenden Vorträgen, das werden wir jetzt sehen, in die digitale Zukunft. Also führe uns da auch hin. Gemeinsam mit seinem Freund, dem Internetguru Ossi Urs, verfasste er das 2012 erschienene Buch Digitale Aufklärung, warum das Internet uns klüger macht, das als Digital Enlightenment Now auch auf Englisch erschienen ist. Tim, ich bitte dich hier auf die Bühne.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank für die nette Anmoderation. Ich werde allerdings jetzt auf Wunsch unserer Veranstalter die Sprache wechseln. Ich habe ja das große Glück, dass ich 2 Muttersprachen habe. Ich bin 50 Jahre lang in Deutschland gewesen, aber ich bin in Amerika geboren und aufgewachsen. And for this reason, I'm going to switch without further ado into my first mother tongue and hold this talk in English. Hang on. At least I hoped I was going to give it in English. Sag mal, irgendwie funktioniert die Fernbedienung nicht. Nein, also sie funktioniert nicht. Ist sie eingeschaltet?
Das stimmt, es geht gar nicht.
Nee. Sie hat gerade den Geist aufgegeben. Also dann müssen wir bitte hier durchschalten. Da sitzt ja jemand oben, hoffentlich.
Ah, nee, geht. Geht jetzt. Ja, alles gut.
Nee, aber ich verstehe nicht, warum die... Das ist die falsche Präsentation. Okay. Well, in this case, we are going to do the same trick that the lady did. I will show you the German slides. And I will talk in English, okay? Very good. So, internet bashing has become very fashionable in the internet. The internet has caused all the ills that face mankind. Cultural pessimists are having a heyday, like the American computer artist Jaron Lanier, the failed VR entrepreneur who gloomily summed up 20-odd years of internet development with the words, "We have screwed things up." Of course, cultural pessimists have been around for a long time. Socrates, Plato writes, bewailed the introduction of writing into ancient Greece, since it meant that people would no longer be able to memorize long texts. This, he worried, would, quote, plant oblivion in their souls. In the 17th century, the British philosopher Robert Burton, the author of The Anatomy of Melancholy, complained about the flood of books that were due to the inventing of the printing press, which had happened recently, and which was producing sort of an analog version of digital overload that we, of course, are familiar with in the 20th and 21st century. Ossi and I wrote this book. Ossi sadly died just about 3 months after the book was published. Ossi was possibly the wisest person I have ever known. A very interesting guy. He was the product of both the Frankfurt School, he studied under Adorno, and the Indian philosophers, because he spent years in an ashram in Hardwar. And in the book, he actually had the idea for us to write a chapter about the origins of networking, which he traces back to the Upanishads, who believed the total of sum of creation was one great big network. Everything is connected to everything, and everything influences everything. So they were thinking of networks long before the invention of computers or technology. And that made it very, very interesting to talk with him about these things. We wanted to write this book together. And of course, there are two ways to write a book if you have two authors. You can divide up the chapters, and one writes half the chapters and one writes the other half. We tried that. Didn't work because our styles were completely incompatible. When we talked, we understood each other perfectly. And so we decided to talk the book. If you want to, it turned into a huge Platonic dialogue. We sat on the terrace at his house in the Taunus, or at my house in Lungau in the Austrian Alps, and talked. We had an outline of the book. We knew which chapter would contain which subchapters, and so we just talked through the book and recorded it, and then I sat down and transcribed it and edited a little bit, and that was the book. And if I read it today, I get goose pimples, because I can hear Ossi and me talking. And I don't think that either of us would have been able to create this book on his own. The sum is more than the parts. We actually formulated 10 theses on digital enlightenment in this book. And I would like to quote from the book, which is the reason I'm actually reading from a manuscript, which I normally do not do when I hold speeches. I usually talk whatever comes to mind. But first, maybe let me quote a friend of ours, Norbert Bolz, who is a professor at the Berlin Technical Institute, a university, who is widely considered one of the leading postmodern philosophers in media science in Germany. And he once gave a very convincing answer to the question, how can we move on to create a more perfect digital society? He said, more and more of us despair of being able to manage our own attention spans. Actually, it's all a very quite simple question, namely, what is really important? In order to answer, we need to reduce complexity. In our search for orientation, media technologies act as filters. But in the end, it is all about human judgment. Does this mean that digital reading makes our brains turn digital? Behind that kind of question lurks the latest form of cultural pessimism, end quote. The idea that our brains somehow deteriorate or are being crippled by exposure to digital information and communication is essentially misanthropic. Our brains do not dissolve under digital pressure. They merely add new capabilities through evolutionary adaptation, something that has been going on for as long as mankind has existed and which will continue long after we here are all dust. In our book, we set out these 10 theses and hoping to spark a new way of thinking about things digital and maybe even kickstart a social discussion about the spirit, in the spirit of the classical European Enlightenment 200 years ago. Our aim was to ensure that we approach the future with a fresh mindset. Let me run through them very quickly. The first and most important, everything that can be digitized will be digitized. Everything that can be connected will be connected, and that changes everything. The digital revolution runs on internet time, which in turn is governed by Moore's law. Of course, what Moore's law set out back in 1965 was less a law than a hypothesis. Moore's law simply describes a tendency of digital gadgets to double their capacity approximately every 2 years. And this ability to sustain exponential growth also means that the costs of digital computing power falls by about half every 2 years or so. This decline isn't simply restricted to microprocessors and digital storage media, but also affects technology as a whole. Refrigerators, washing machines, TV sets, telephones. since they're all loaded with microchips. And it also influences distribution systems and other services, since they too are managed digitally nowadays. And as always, when markets suffer from falling prices, vendors try to find ways to cut out the middleman by reaching out directly to their potential customers and users. Together, the ongoing digitalization of the economy and the global networks connecting markets and buyers is fundamentally changing both business and society. Digitalization, number 2, and networking are not like the common cold. They will never go away, unlike the coronavirus, hopefully. Digitalization and networking are also radically changing the way we conduct our lives, how we educate and entertain ourselves, how we make purchases, and most especially, how we communicate. Literally every facet of human existence and most human lives are undergoing fundamental upheaval. We therefore must expect this development to continue far into the foreseeable future. 3, the digital world is increasingly permeating the real world. As a result, both are changing with breathtaking speed. There is no back to normal because we can't rewrite history. In fact, the rapid convergence and coalescence of digital and physical makes it increasingly difficult to tell the two apart. Take navigation aids, which used to simply tell us how to get from A to B, hopefully. With the digital world encroaching on the physical, we can now expect our gadgets to show us the, quote, right way, based on the digital information they gather. This might be the fastest route, maybe the most scenic, depending on taste and circumstances. Augmented reality does not simply mean reality is being enriched. It changes our whole perception and our understanding of reality. What we think of as real will increasingly reflect a mixture of digital and physical perceptions and experiences conveyed by smartphones or by Google Glass, or maybe one day through BCIs, brain-computer interfaces. Either way, we will become more and more accustomed to navigating something best described as the digital infosphere that will surround us just like the physical atmosphere of our home planet. But don't worry, this won't turn us all into zombies marching helplessly to the drumbeat of our digital masters. Quite the opposite, in fact. We must, however, develop our ability to discern between the relevant and the irrelevant. In effect, to filter out the noise and tune in to those sources of information that will enrich our lives and help us become masters of our own destinies. And if the information turns out to be a distraction, we must learn to be strong and smart enough to simply switch it off. A few years ago, digital fasting was all the rage in certain circles. Maybe that was not such a bad idea. But of course, disconnecting from the digital infosphere will be like watching a silent movie. Yes, we may even relish the experience as a form of aesthetical self-denial or something like that. By doing so, we may deprive ourselves of a multimedial dimension to our lives, but in doing so, we give ourselves the opportunity to heighten our awareness of the other aspects of perceived reality. And always, of course, we will be aware that by simply pressing a button, we can return to the more richer and satisfying dimension, one where we feel more truly at home. Number 4, digitalization and networking create a new technical, social, cultural, and scientific condition. In order to appreciate these changes fully, we first need to categorize them before we can begin to describe and understand their new qualities. We are already at the point where our perception of reality is changing in many ways, as have the conditions under which we experience this new reality. Is a computer game less real than a walk in the woods? Is a love affair on Facebook less rich and enriching than a flirt at the hotel bar? Perhaps the fact that digital experiences are based on binary code influences our assumptions. After all, if the only two possible digital conditions are on and off, maybe real and unreal are also just two sides of the same coin. In fact, we have already collectively learned that digital information can help us understand the world around us in a more gradual and modular way, without, it is to be hoped, losing sight of their inherent interconnectedness. Digitalization and networking obviously influence the way we experience and understand and deal with reality. In fact, the conditions under which we do so are also undergoing continuous change. The pace is so rapid, so dynamic, our own experience so mind-shaking, that we are in danger of forgetting to digest what is going on around us, both intellectually and conceptually. The wealth of new developments and experiences in technology, society, culture, and science demand and deserve a new way of describing them, a new terminology more suited to the digital age, just as it's difficult to describe quantum physics using the vocabulary of Newton mechanics. It will be impossible to define the digital world using concepts and phrases originally developed for the analog age. 5. After a run of 150 years, mass media are losing their ability to forge communality and identity. As a result, communication is destined to return to its roots as interpersonal exchanges, albeit through digital media. Human society is being reformatted as we speak, and our perception of reality shifts. The familiar guardrails disappear. Orientation aids that normally helped us access the world around us are wobbling. This affects not only religion and other belief systems, be they scientific or philosophical, but especially the old mass media and their ability to influence society, shape opinions, and create a sense of common identity. The New York Times may still claim to bring us all the news that's fit to print, but in truth, those days are long gone. There are a number of reasons for this, both cultural and economic. Due to a dramatic fall in the costs of disseminating information, mass media are losing their grip. At the same time, their business models are crumbling, largely due to short-sightedness on the part of publishers and broadcasters, who have failed repeatedly to understand what is happening, and the lack of vision and courage to change course. The daily newspaper is not simply an endangered species, it's completely irrelevant to a generation of kids who are accustomed to get their news, all the news they want to read or watch, free of charge and from a wide range of sources. Maybe newspapers or the daily news, but also friends, bloggers, news shows, parodies such as The Daily Show, or social media sites such as Facebook or Twitter. The business model of mass media is rapidly becoming antique. I just looked up the numbers for the Bild-Zeitung. Sorry, I used to work for Bild-Zeitung 25 years ago, and we had a circulation of 8 million. Today, Bild-Zeitung has 1.3 million, and they're struggling. The business model is becoming antique. In fact, this leads us back to the communication needs and habits of the zoon politikon, Aristotle's political animal, a being whom it is impossible to conceive of in the singular. As a society, we are being cast back on the original function of communication as an exchange, a function mass media are inherently incapable of performing. As we as society fall back on the agora, the marketplace of ideas, mass media will fall away and die. Instead, it is important that collectively we develop the necessary mobility and strength of argument to exist in a digital society. Number 6, digitalization and networking inevitably lead to mass acceleration and disruption in technology and media. These are impossible to control. All we can do is hang on and hold our hats. It took approximately 350 years for Gutenberg's invention of the printing press to give us the first mass circulation newspaper in the early 19th century. It took the World Wide Web only 5 years to grow from the brainchild of Tim Berners-Lee to the largest mass medium the world has ever seen. And it took only 3 years for mobile phones, smartphones, to change the way consumers in the US and Europe, especially in Asia and Latin America, access and use the internet. Welcome to the age of acceleration, where technology and media evolve so quickly that business models can't keep up and where established products and players disappear almost overnight. The term disruption perfectly describes what happens if businesses encounter exponential innovation. In 1942, the Austrian economist Josef Schumpeter described what he called creative destruction as a process of industrial mutation that increasingly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old, incessantly creating the new. Nowhere has it been proven right more dramatically than in the internet age, where normal markets suddenly implode in a burst of dynamic innovation, and the rules are constantly being rewritten. Established brands and corporate giants are forced to adapt or die. The iPhone is probably the best example of such a disruptive technology, allowing Apple to redefine the world market for mobile telephones and pushing long-established leaders like Nokia and Research in Motion, the creators of the BlackBerry, to the wall. In less than 3 years, Apple catapulted itself from a newcomer in the phone market to the market leader, and in the process invented a completely new mass market, namely the mobile internet. Formerly the domain of a few techie geeks, online mobility has become a gigantic industry and an everyday fact of life. More important, the iPhone has created an entirely new lifestyle, one that has influenced the lives and the self-esteem of millions around the world. An all-purpose tool for all things digital, the Swiss Army knife of the digital age, someone called the iPhone. And more importantly, the original, something which is actually counterintuitive in the digital world where there is no original. Original and copy are identical. However, it would be both presumptive and blue-eyed to think that we could accurately predict such disruptive markets, although this hardly discourages so-called futurologists and trend scouts from trying. 20 years ago, anyone crazy enough to predict that texting would one day become the killer app of the worldwide mobile phone industry would have been laughed out of the conference room. And the same applies for those who believe they can handle disruption. The history of enterprises such as IBM, Siemens, Nokia, and Sony prove that only those who are able to reinvent themselves in a disruptive situation can hope to survive. The age of acceleration gives no one a second chance. Number 7, life in such a fundamentally different world would become more complex, but not necessarily more complicated. In fact, it will probably be simpler and less stressful. Understanding what is going on in a world where disruption is happening may not be easy, but it could be well worth the effort. If we manage to come to grips with the changes around us, the reward will be the realization that life in such a fundamentally new reality can be more convoluted, but not necessarily more difficult. Quite the opposite. Those who understand how to make best use of disruptive innovation, or at least are willing to try, can lead richer and more rewarding lives. But first, we need to make the extra effort. Human beings, too, will need to reconsider how they conduct their lives. We need to develop the ability to think in a digitally and networked fashion, and in real time. As the German philosopher and cultural theorist Peter Sloterdijk writes in his book, You Must Change Your Life, mankind in the 21st century faces the need to, quote, think dangerously. Essentially, this requires lots of heavy mental exercise, but perhaps as we sweat on our mental treadmills, we can console ourselves with the thought that our object is to appreciate and penetrate the digital and connected systems which surround us. In fact, to function the way the human brain is programmed to work, we need to synthesize what we perceive in order to distill those perceptions into an interconnected view of the world and ourselves. Human thought, many cognitive scientists now believe, works essentially like a computer network. This does not, however, mean that we are or will become machines, the automaton so popular with Enlightenment thinkers and cultural pessimists of all ages. Instead, we need to understand that similarities between networked systems and human thought processes. This has less to do with the concept of internalization, as in the psychological sense, and more with differentiation, as understood by computer scientists, an essentially human form of information processing. The difficulty here lies not so much in the act of processing information, but in the ability to handle the results. 9, concepts and experiences from the analog past do not provide guidance in a dynamically developing digital future. Anyone espousing them in a debate about the digital age will seem increasingly out of time or out of place, helpless, in fact. Yet there is another question we must ask before we can seriously talk about the role of mankind in the age of the internet. Are we culturally and linguistically prepared for what we are experiencing? Notions and concepts that date back to the analog age are increasingly incapable of describing what's going on. They appear antiquated, even quaint. Harking back to the great media and technology debates of the 60s and 70s, we quickly see just how irrelevant they are today. The hot button issues back then, such as commercial television or population census, are about as important today as the number of angels dancing on the head of a pin. Even new media are no longer new or news. And issues such as data protection and privacy have a distinctly old world flavor in the age of WikiLeaks and the NSA. Listening to Jaron Lanier bemoaning what he insists on decrying as digital Maoism, or when Frank Schirmacher of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung complained that his brain was being mashed up by Google, one can't help feeling oneself set back a couple of decades, if not centuries. And finally, the 10th thesis, so we need a digital enlightenment. New and original intellectual categories that will help us function as humans in a fundamentally changed world. This is vital if we are to reflect critically and productively about ourselves and our role in a digital society. Mankind has stood at similar crossroads before. In the 18th century, for instance, ossified social structures and economic shifts forced intellectuals in Europe to fundamentally rethink the rules by which society functions. Caught between the classical logic of antiquity and medieval scholasticism on the one hand, ever-widening cracks in the old order on the other, free thinkers were forced to reconsider their basic beliefs and to adapt to change. It was against this background that the German moral philosopher Immanuel Kant penned his famous dictum, "To think for oneself at all times, that is enlightenment," or, quoting Horace, "Sapere aude," have the courage to use your ability to think. We're traveling uncharted waters here. We need new maps and compasses to guide us. With them, hopefully, we will be able to literally and collectively survey the world anew. Thank you very much.